Hi, my name is David Lee, and today I'm going to talk about Bicep, how to design and implement Bicep. So, as usual, before we begin diving into how we're thinking about designing and implementing Bicep, let's talk about a use case so that we can use that as a reference in our design and implementation. So, first thing that we see here is Contoso has a requirement to use infrastructure as code to deploy any applications to the cloud, and they've decided on a .NET application, and if they have decided that they're going to be using app service as a way to host the .NET application. The second requirement that they have is, everything should be managed as code, so including configuration. So they're not just thinking about infrastructure as code, but they are also thinking about, having all those configurations in code, so that if anyone tries to make changes, or if anyone has additional configuration that they need to add, it's all done through code. It's all audited because it's all in code, and so that kind of helps with their compliance. And the last thing, obviously, is tagging. And as usual, all resources should be tagged. And in our case, it's the purpose and the owner. The purpose of the resource and the owner of those resources. So when we talk about designing Bicep, we're really thinking about the concepts of how we can pass values into Biceps, which we call parameters, how we can create variables within our Bicep file, so that we can leverage some common names across different aspects of the Bicep structure. Obviously, we're going to be defining resources such as app service. And then there's also the capability to output any of the results, such as, the name of the app service that is being created. There are several ways to execute and implement our Bicep. We can do it through Azure PowerShell, Azure CLI. From a CI/CD process perspective, we have the option to use Azure DevOps Pipeline deployment tasks. In GitHub, there is a GitHub deployment action for deploying our Bicep. In fact, it uses the same options as if we are executing an ARM template. So in our demo today, we'll focus on executing our Bicep through the Azure CLI interface. All right, so before going into Bicep, what I'm going to do is create a .NET 6 application with some configuration so that we can demonstrate some of the configuration as code practices. So I'm going to go ahead and do a new project. It's going to create a .NET web app. I'm going to call it Bicep Demo. I'm going to click next here. I'm going to actually choose the Microsoft Identity Platform so that we can actually have single sign-on, which is where we talk about the configuration as code concepts. I'm going to click Create. All right, so it does require me to have the .NET tool, identity tool. All right, very good. So what I'm going to do here is, if we start looking at this section here for Azure AD, for us to single sign on into the application itself, we do need to populate the Azure AD setting. So this is what I'm going to do next. All right, so now that we're on the Azure portal, we're going to go ahead and create the app registration so that we can populate some of the values in our local environment. So if you don't have it already available in your portal, you can use the search capability to search for Azure Active Directory, and then simply go to app registration, where we can click on new registration. And this is where we can configure our application. for those configuration values. So I'm just going to call this Bicep demo. It's going to be a single tenant, and I'm going to actually register this as a web. Now, in the local environment, you're going to actually have your configuration of where you want a single sign-on to. So if we go back to our Visual Studio application, we can see that there's actually a callback path of sign-in -OIDC, which really is where when you single sign-on, you're going to be redirected back to the application, and this is going to be part of that path. The other thing to be clear on is, if you actually go to launch settings, you will see that your application, let's say you're going to use IIS for your debugging. Well, it's gonna actually launch it in localhost, but then there's this SSL port, right? So it's going to be that https://localhost with this port number, and then redirecting back to sign in OIDC. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this and I'm going to go back to the portal. And I am going to copy this value. Oops, and make sure I don't have that extra slash. All right, so this is where the application will be redirected back to. I'm gonna hit register to register this application, app registration. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm going to enable ID token so that we have that. And really what you can do is there's a lot of great documentation here that talks about what you should enable for your specific scenario. So in this case, we're going to enable ID token. I'm going to hit save here. All right. And so now I can go ahead and take some of the values and start copying it over, right? So I'm going to go back to overview. I'm going to copy my application ID. Go back here, and here you can see that I'm going to plug in my client ID, which is the application ID. If I go back, I have my tenant ID, and I'm going to go back and copy it there. And the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to have my domain. Again, going back to the portal. And for the domain is actually going to be found, let's see, in your overview, and this is where you can just copy it over. Oops. Okay. All right, so now we're able to test out our configuration. And for testing out our configuration, I'm going to just hit Bicep demo run here, which should launch IIS. And in fact, it is launching. So what we just noticed was it was actually launching in non-IIS, which if you recall, my configuration was IIS specific. So the URL needs to match up, and so I have to run it in IIS. And so now you can see that this port number matches up. All right, so it's asking me to accept the verification that it wants to read some of my basic information, and accept that, right? So now we're single sign on, we're signed in, and you can see that I'm signed in as an admin on my domain. All right, so we're ready to create our Bicep file. And before we start creating our Bicep file, what's important is we make sure that we actually have the Bicep extension installed in Visual Studio Code, so that we can have that IntelliSense when we start designing our Bicep file. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back and create a new file. We're going to call it deploy.bicep. And you can kind of see that there's this icon, Bicep icon, already available. So the first thing to really think about is what are the parameters that you're going to be passing into your Bicep file, right? Because you really don't want to be hard coding anything, especially if you are also thinking about deploying this across multiple environments such as development, QA, UAT, production, right? So what I'm going to do is I have a naming convention that I typically follow where for all the Azure resources names, I usually like to pass them in. And so I have this practice of calling them with some prefix and, having this concept of stack in front of it. So I'm just going to define a parameter stack prefix, which is a string, right? And so just keep noticing, notice that we also kind of declare what type it is. But, if we kind of look at the different options, right? Again, right, IntelliSense is going to help us figure out figure out which one is the best option. The next thing that I like to do is I'd like to define an environment, right? So it could be development, again, QA, and so on and so forth. I also like to pass in the owner of the different resources, right? Again, if you think about the requirements, we need to tag all the different resources. Another thing that I like to do is define the location. Now, I actually like to have a default for my location. And as an organization, you might have that as well, where you want all your resources to be in a specific location, right? Because you already planned for it from a DR perspective. And so my location, my primary location is Central US. So we're just gonna go from here. So the other thing that I like to do is I like to create a variable for now on what are the names that I want to name all my resources, right? So my convention, and you could have your own convention, is that I like to name my resources with obviously the prefix, name that I pass in, but I also like to, include my environment, right? So what we can see here is, this concept of variable is I could now use this concept of stacking across all my resources, but you can also see the way that I'm trying to concatenate, right, is using this dollar curly bracket technique, right, or syntax, and kind of concatenating my strings that way. The other thing now we would like to do is start defining our tags, right? So tagging is important. And the way that we name our tags is, I have, and again, right, the purpose of this particular resource, and just giving it a name. So this is kind of, and this is a demo. So I'm just going to call it Bicep, right? This is kind of the purpose. And then we also want to define our environment. Um, it wasn't specified earlier in the requirements, but this is kind of the standard. Um, the other that I want to tag that I want to make sure it's there is the owner, and I'm gonna put stack owner here, right? All right. So the other thing, we start also notice, we have curly, yellow curly lines, on our parameters or variables, which helps us be informed of, unused variables or parameters, right? Which is great, a great way to be able to help us write code. So now the next thing that I'm going to do is start defining my resources. So I'm going to define my app service. So if you kind of are in the Azure space for a little time, you know that before you define your app service, you need to define an app service plan, right? And in Azure, the app service plan, there's a lot of tiers to choose from, right? There's a free, basic, shared basic, premium, type of tier, standard, right, as well. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to define the app service plan. And for defining the app service plan, this is something that is not intuitive, but you got to know is, you're really defining a server farm, right? So now IntelliSense is telling us that there's various versions to choose from, right? And this is because in the backend, this is gonna translate to an ARM template, and an ARM template really is a way to, define, call a defined API on the backend, right? So Microsoft exposes the Azure Resource Manager as APIs on the backend, and there's versionings, and so this is why we're kind of picking the version here. And also making sure that we're not having breaking changes, right? Because sometimes API could have changes. So that's why we're kind of coding it this way. And now I am going to declare the resource. So first thing that I'm going to do is declare the name. And what I like to do is actually make use of our stack name, right? And this is a variable, and then append something called plan at the end of it. So this is making it more intuitive. You always got to define a location, and I'm going to say this is the location. Now I'm going to define the tags, but I already declared it earlier, right? So I'm kind of reusing it from here, and I'm going to define the SKU that I'm going to use. So for this demo, I am just going to use the free tier. And so I just need to name the name, which is F1 and free. So I'm just going to use the free version of app service for this demo. But you could parameterize this, and you should parameterize this because your development environment, you might use perhaps not free but basic, right? And in your production, you might use a more a standard SKU, for example, right? So this should be definitely parameterized, but for the purpose of this demo, we're not going to do that. All right, so I'm now ready to declare the app service. And for the app service, again, this is something that you probably need to know, is that this is a web, and this is going to be a site. So again, the version, typically you want your versions to be consistent for your app service plan, right? So this is why they're the same here. So I'm just going to use the stack name for the name of the resource. The location would be the stack location. All right, so this is, again, something that you need to know, is, what is the kind, and this is going to be the ab. For the app service, there's tags. So there's really, common themes when you declare a resource, right? Always kind of have the name, location, and tags that you can leverage. Obviously, there's things like properties that are also kind of common across a lot of the resources. So this is that. I'm gonna for my app service, I'm just gonna say for my HTTPS only, I'm gonna set it to true. So it's always gonna be HTTPS only. And then now I need to reference my app service to my app plan, right? And this is where that server farm ID needs to be. So how do you reference it? You use, you declare, and actually I shouldn't be calling this app name here, which is a bad name. I wouldn't call it app plan instead. And I'm gonna come down here and say ID. There we go. So see IntelliSense, right? Again, this is very intuitive to use. Bicep is very intuitive to use. Set config. Now this is where I'm starting to define, what type of app service plan this is. I'm sorry, app service this is. And if we kind of look at some of the configuration, we can actually kind of look here. But if we were kind of looking at some examples online, we know that we have to set up the net framework version. And if again, this is something that you probably want to always find examples and just use, right? And the example is this is the v6.0. There is actually one more setting that I need to put in, which is called the metadata setting, which isn't part of the specs. So unfortunately, this is something that needs to be put in order for the app to be recognized as .NET. So I'm just copying it from prepared script here, but you can see that now it's saying that hey, it's not allowed, right? I don't think this is part of site config, and which is why I need to use this technique to disable that comment. So this is definitely necessary for us for the app service to recognize as .NET. You can definitely try it without, but probably you would see that there are some issues with the configuration later on. Now we're ready to talk about app settings and the concept of configuration as code. So we do have several settings, right? And the way that we define our app settings is we have this concept of name and value. Okay, so what should be in the app settings? Basically, if we recall, in our .NET code project that we have created earlier, we have this Azure AD configuration. Okay, so the way that is represented and if you recall, it's a JSON structure that is have a parent-child kind of relationship, right? So the way that we kind of organize this in app services is we declare this we declare that value with this kind of colon, right? So if it's Azure AD and then there's a child instance, right? And then with the value, then we kind of concatenate it like this. All right, so now we have the Azure AD instance. What we need to do is we need to put in the value. So I'm just gonna quickly bring us back here, and you can see that the instance is kind of the login Microsoft.com, right? So instead of hard coding it that way, I'm going to use a function that is provided out of the box called environment. And so if we kind of use the environment, we can see that there's a lot of options that provide us with some of the hard-coded values, it's not hard-coded from my perspective because I'm using some of the functions to declare it. So if it changes, right, it's somebody would make sure that it is updated on the environment. So I'm actually going to be using the correct login endpoint, right? So again, I don't want to do that work. Somebody's doing that work for me, and I absolutely love it. I'm going to be passing in the domain. All right, so the domain is something that needs to be passed in, and it's always in the context of .microsoft.com. Right, so what I'm going to do is I need to not hard code that, but I'm going to pass it in, right? Which means I'm going to go back to parameter and declaring it over there, right? So now I can do my domain here, and now I need to declare my tenant. Okay, so fortunately for tenants, there is also an helper function, right? Although it's not hard coded, but there's a subscription function, and my tenant ID does appear here. Okay, so the last few things is the client ID, and this is going to be passed in as well. Okay. Right, great. So now I am going to declare the callback path, right? Now the callback path, I am going to hard code because it doesn't change, right? So I would say this is fine for passing it in. All right. And now we are ready to execute this. Now, I'm actually going to do one more thing here, which isn't required, but you know, what if I need to reference the app service name later on? So I could do an output app service name, declare it with a type, and now I can pass this externally. So when I run my ARM template, this is going to you know, be passed. So I will execute it in Azure CLI next. All right, so we're actually in Azure CLI where my Azure CLI commands for deploying the Bicep file is located. And what I've done earlier is I have actually used this upload feature to upload my Bicep file here. Obviously, in your environment, you may have Azure CLI on your local box, which is great. And you don't have to do this, but this is what I've done. So the file is actually there. I've uploaded it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a resource group to host my workload. So this is the AZ group create command that will create that resource group. Okay, very good. So what we're going to do next is I am going to now deploy my Bicep file. So the command to deploy the Bicep file is actually a command that is used by Azure CLI, the ARM template as well. It's called the AZ deployment group create. So you could use the same technique for deploying your ARM template as well. But in our case, I'm deploying my Bicep file. So the name of the deployment is deploy-1. The group is Bicep demo, which is what we just created. My template file is deploy.bicep, which is what I've named it. Now I'm ready to send in my parameters, right? So if you recall, I have my prefix. So I'm just, just going to name all my resources Bicep demo app1. And then my environment is going to be dev. I already plug in the client ID into a variable and then the domain into a variable as well earlier. And now I have, I'm also putting the stack owner in, right? So now I'm ready to execute my command. And so this deployment is actually going to deploy my Bicep into that resource group that we just created. And we'll give it a few moments to run. All right, so the deployment is actually done and we're ready to review the changes in our resource group. So let's go to the Azure portal, and what I've done is I've launched the resource group, and we can see that my application has been created. I'm going to click on my app service. I'm sorry, my app service has been created, and you can see that the tagging that we put in place is there. And the thing that before we try to test our application is we do need to take this URL and do the app registration your update, redirect update, right? Because otherwise, this URL would not be accepted. So what I've done is I went ahead in the app registration and added this URL slash the signing in OIDC. So the redirect will happen naturally. Before we try to launch the application, very quickly on the configuration as code section is if we go to configuration in the app service itself and wait for it to launch, and we actually see things like the callback path, right, are all configured correctly in our app service, right? So this really speaks to the concept of configuration as code. And again, like remember we were using um, the functions in Bicep, right, to generate this login microsoftonline.com, right? So some of those are taken care of, which is really great. So now we're ready to test our application. And before testing our application, we need to obviously deploy it. So I am going to download a published profile here, and I'm going to go back to my Visual Studio application, which I'm going to, and then what I'm going to do is I am going to publish. I'm going to import the profile that I just downloaded. And I'm going to publish that to my app service. And this will take several moments. All right, so the publish has succeeded, and now we're ready to test our application. So what we'll do is we'll go back to our browser, we'll plug in the Bicep demo app URL, and we are actually single sign-on or sign on into the application itself with it recognizing our domain name. I'm sorry, our username. So this kind of shows the power of Bicep and how we are thinking about designing and implementing Bicep. So hope you like this video. Thank you so much.